All right, looks like it's 1 o'clock, so time for us to get started. Hope everybody's having a good Trailhead DX, and welcome to Switching It Up with Apex. Before we do anything else, I have to present your attention to the forward-looking statement slide, one that I'm sure you all know and love, previously by its affectionate safe harbor name. The gist of that being, make any and all purchasing decisions based off currently available functionality and not about any forward-looking statements. And since this presentation is mostly forward-looking statements, that's kind of important for us to repeat. With that said, I'm Chris Peterson. I'm a senior product manager on Apex and Platform Cache. And up on stage with me, I have Jim. Hi. And Anand.
Hi.
A principal and senior engineer from the Apex team. To start things off, question, did everybody know that Apex has a new compiler? A few people did because we talked about it at Dreamforce, but it's something that we're proud of how little impact we had on customers and how much freedom that this new architectural innovation gives us. It's one of the reasons we're able to create Switch is because the new compiler made it substantially easier for us to add new language constructs and have that flow to all of our tooling that makes use of the new compiler across the platform. But first, why did we build the new compiler? The short answer is testability. We have an incredibly complex suite of unit tests on the new compiler. It's awesome. It gives us a ton of confidence that we're not going to break anything. It's also decoupled from the rest of the core platform, so we can run it independently. It's a core part of our dev tool strategy going forward. And it also allows other use cases independent of that in some interesting new ways that we're going to innovate going forward. But we built the new Apex compiler, and we rolled it out to millions of organizations. And outside of a very small number of cases, nobody noticed. So we're incredibly proud of that. And until we mentioned it at Dreamforce, nobody had really realized that. It was a complex multi-phase project that included a number of intermediate steps to really deliver on that guarantee of not breaking you. We actually built a separate compiler mode that made it so that old compiler and new compiler were invoked side by side, and the actual bytecode and database dependencies were all validated to be exactly the same. So true gold standard has to produce the same output before we put it into production. We even went as far as to make the job that changes your org to the new compiler run a full compilation of your org and refuse to switch if there's any validation errors. So we put a ton of energy into this, and we're really proud that it's wrapped up. Summer is when it's going to be available truly everywhere. There's a couple of stragglers, but most people are already on it. And one cool thing we did to finish up the rollout is we modified the critical update framework to allow per org critical updates. So if you're somebody who has dependencies on the old compiler that don't carry forward to the new, you'll have a critical update that's tailored to you and tells you what the problem is, what line of code, and gives you a way to say that you think you fixed it and have us verify that. So that's a really cool functionality that we think is going to help roll out Apex changes going forward. It's much more powerful than the way we've done that type of communication previously. I don't see Dan Appelman in the room, but a quote from him at Dreamforce was that this is one of the greatest feats of engineering I've ever seen. So we're very proud to have that type of feedback. And with the compiler work behind us, we can start delivering on new features based on top of it, starting with switch. So we're going to switch how you write conditional logic.
So hi again. So you may be wondering, why do we pick switch? Well, on the idea exchange, we had over 17,000 points, which as far as anyone's told me is the most developer points given, so you guys kept asking for it. And we also wanted to help simplify your logic. You know, I'm a developer, I don't like long chains of if-else if I can replace it with a simplified switch statement. We also wanted to improve your trigger flow, and we wanted to add an additional enum to help with that, so make triggers a little bit easier to understand and maintain. And, most popular languages like Java, Scala, C#, C, all of those, they have some form of switching or pattern matching in them, so we wanted to join the club finally. And we wanted to show off the power of the new compiler externally and internally. With the new compiler, it was much easier to implement, and we can innovate quicker, and we get a lot of tooling advantages that come with the new compiler, and that Switch gets to take advantage of. So we had quite a few things we valued while coming up with an implementation, and we had a lot of hurdles and obstacles that we faced. The largest was that everyone has an opinion on Switch, and each language has its own little nuance of what makes a switch. Some people think fall through are intrinsic to Switch if they're familiar with Java or C, but it's not in every language. C# has kind of an optional fall through. Some languages don't have fall through at all. And we wanted to create a thing that was, feature rich but familiar to Apex developers and uniquely Salesforce. And we wanted to work through the community with the Trailblazer Forums to create something that we wanted to, empower everyone building on top of Salesforce. Personally, I like to say Apex has grown organically over the years, and it's not like a very structured, formal approach that Java, where they go back and forth for many years trying to argue about what to put in the language, why, and whatnot. And for Switch, we wanted to take a similar approach, but more lighthearted, to work with the community and throughout Salesforce versus just a single developer like me just shipping a new feature to you guys. And so I'll go over the list of things we thought we valued the most. We wanted to help reduce code duplication, and we wanted to support a few types, not every type that we could think of, so enums, strings, integers, and longs. We also wanted to be Salesforce-y, so we wanted to handle fields over polymorphic S-object types, and you'll hear a term that Chris and I will use called implicit casting, so we want to be able to help go straight forward from one S-object type to a specific S-object type. And we want it to be familiar to all developers from all backgrounds, language or admin or the professional developer, while leaving the opportunity to expand upon Switch. Like, this is just our version 1, and we've been wanting to expand upon it, but we didn't want to come out running. We wanted to walk before we could run. So there's a lot of great ideas out there, but we could only pick some to get into a release. And our famous obstacle. So people have guessed and have heard that case isn't a keyword in Apex. It's an S-object type, which was frustrating and causing a lot of grief. And it's also can be an identifier, so that was one of the biggest hurdles. And one of my favorite, when I presented this proposal to people, is like, why isn't it like Java? No, I mean like exactly like Java. And so, here's the nice little happy path of the final proposal with a simplified little case. So we're doing a little switch on a simple integer I here, and so we have switch on, and then we have a few when cases, which I'll kind of substitute when to case and back and forth. So let's not stay specific. So we have when 2, 3, 4. So it can take multiple literals, or we can just take a single literal, like when 7. And then you'll notice at the end we didn't want to add another keyword for default, so we have the when else. And that's just a nice little happy path of following through with a simple integer. And so we presented, this was our final, what we ended up with. We had an original proposal, and we sent it out to you on the Trailblazer Forum, and we got some great feedback, and it kind of looked like this. Yeah, so it was like, hey, that's not Java. I like some parts of it. I don't like this at all. But we had some seriously good feedback from you guys, and it was really helpful. So one of the first ones was about code coverage requirements. And code coverage is something, for better or for worse, that we require you to have at Salesforce. But we had this concept that we were worried about managed enums, and we were wondering, we didn't want developers to break their subscribers by adding managed enums that wouldn't meet the requirements of the switch. And so our initial iteration required a default case on any enum. And then someone presented a counter argument that ends up making dead code that you can't test. And so that hurts your code coverage. And we felt like, oh, that kind of contradicts ourselves. We're telling you to do one thing, write a default statement, while also having code coverage requirements. And that contradicts itself, and we didn't want you to put you in that spot. So we decided to remove that requirement and leave it up to the developers' organization's requirements. Like, what is the best practice? Some people want to require default, some people don't. We leave that up to you, and we're not going to force you to do it. You might have seen our initial proposal. We kind of had a case if, where if is a little delimiter between our proposal of case, case, case. And people didn't really like it. We wanted to try to be similar to case, but it wasn't a happy thing, so one of the proposals added the when clause, and we kind of liked it, and we went with it, because when it's 3 less characters,
And
So
conveniently, it was also a reserved word, which
Yeah.
made the choice pretty easy.
it's also a keyword, and so it's not unlike case. And we were happy to go with that suggestion, and it conveys a very similar message that we didn't think there was a problem. Another one was clarity around opening and closing braces. So I was trying to actually reduce some code, and I thought, oh, we don't really need this. This is redundant. It's not necessary for functionality, but people presented that their text editor, allows collapsing of the switch statement if you have opening and closing braces. And as a context reading, you might read a large switch statement. You want to know when it starts and when it ends. So it wasn't a functional requirement, but it helped readability and maintainability. So we were happy to put it in, and we never would have thought of that without your help. The other one, which I found amusing, was triggering them. So someone asked, hey, you guys have all these Booleans on a trigger context to figure out if it's before or after or insert or delete. And it's like, it would be great if you had an enum. And we kind of laughed internally because that was our goal for the summer release, but we weren't sure if we were going to get to it. And we were happy that we did, and you called us out on it, and we managed to push forward and get it in, and we think it really cleans up some code. And with that said, we would like to thank the entire community.
Yeah, this was an incredibly positive experience for us from a product and engineering perspective to get the amount of feedback that we did on the Switch proposal. It's a pattern that we'd like to repeat in the future, considering how much it impacted our designs for the better. And a sincere thank you to everybody who participated on that. You made the platform better in ways that will be tangible for years to come. With that, we'll take you into a demo.
All right. So all of us have seen how all of us can think about the first time we thought of using Apex. Say I signed up a brand new Salesforce org. I've come across some logic that I want to implement in my Salesforce org that talks to multiple objects, or that does some sort of validation when I change the database state. So typical org looks like this. You've got triggers on your built-in objects, triggers on your custom objects. Go through and look at some of the code here really quickly. So, right, just a second. So we've seen one of the best practices we have advised folks who write Apex is to write one trigger per object so that you don't run into issues with the order of execution of triggers, and you generally delegate all of your trigger execution to a trigger handler. And this is an example of a typical trigger that just has one line of code that delegates to a handler. Some folks like to have a general handler that then delegates to object-specific handlers. So in here, you see an example of a trigger handler that takes in the S-object type, and it takes in a bunch of context variables that will help your handler do the logic that it needs to do. If you notice here, we've compressed this quite a bit.
Yeah, that seems a little verbose to me.
Yeah, there are a bit too many parameters for my liking. As Jim mentioned earlier, we have added a new enum that helps you talk about all the possible trigger operations. And this enum is also available on your trigger context as a new trigger context variable called operation type. And in just a minute, I will show you what the trigger handler looks like. Let me go over to the dev console. There you go. That's what an old trigger handler would look like, right? You have all of these parameters. They don't even fit on the screen, right? You have the S object type, your old rows, your new rows, whether it's a before trigger, whether it's an after trigger, and a bunch of other information that you need. And you pass it into your trigger handler, and you invoke it. We felt, oh, we're doing switch. Can we make it better? And so we did. If you scroll down to the new way, you could write a trigger handler like this. You just need the 3 parameters. You need all your old rows, you need your new rows, and you need this new enum we added called system.triggeroperation. System.triggeroperation exposes all the possible combinations of the Boolean variables, like before insert, after insert, before update, before upsert, all of them. And it allows you to collapse all of your if-else logic into a simple switch statement. And I'm going to show you an example of that with our account trigger handler. So your account trigger handler now looks a lot cleaner. You can now handle your trigger operation, and you can now also do the operation on a single account in this manner.
And it's worth remembering that you can add multiple literals of the enum to each where clause. So if you have the same logic being invoked under multiple conditions, that's a comma-separated list and not a repetition of your logic.
Right. One thing that I wanted to call out that Jim mentioned earlier, the implicit casting. So the generic S objects do not support polymorphism in any sort. Here, we are modeling a sort of implied polymorphism. So the generic S object is implicitly casted to this account ACCT variable if the S object is of type account. So that you don't need to do the S object type check. You don't need to do a cast. And your code just looks cleaner.
Yeah, so to reiterate on this, for anybody who missed this, I think this is probably one of the reasons we deviated from the Java standard is this type of verbosity saving feature. For our first row variable, if it's of type account, so first row is an S object, generic type. If it's of type account, that when clause will automatically cast it to an account, assign it to the ACCT variable, and then invoke that block. If we didn't do that, you would have to have an explicit cast as the first line of every when conditional, which seemed to be very counter to our goal of reducing code duplication. So this is exactly the type of feature that we wanted to add as a value add on top of general language development of Switch. It's because Salesforce is so tightly coupled to the database layer, we can do this type of labor and code saving things for you.
Right, and so if I were to test this, my test is pretty simple. I have an account handler, I have all of my events set up, I'm doing an insert trigger. I'm going to run this test and see what I get. Oop, my bad. Go down to the test view, and the test passed. I go to the logs view, and look at the new log that was generated. All right, it looks like our test ran. It used the new switch statement and the new enums that we have added and correctly identified that this was an account trigger that just fired, and it was a before insert trigger. That was a quick demo of the new switch statement. And with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chris.
Yep. And that was obviously a stripped-down demo to demonstrate the language construct. But we're excited to see what you all do with adding it to trigger frameworks so they're community maintained and all sorts of other innovative use cases that we probably haven't even guessed of yet. So I'll recap a couple of differences from the syntax on Java, just to make them explicit. We have switch on a variable. We then have an opening brace that's unique. It allows full ability in things that aren't full IDEs, like Sublime Text, which I know is very popular among the Apex developer crowd. So we wanted to make sure that was supported. We also believe that it helps readability for admins fairly substantially, especially if developers aren't using good whitespace practices. It definitely makes things a lot easier. Due to the lack of fall-through is why one of the reasons we decided not to support fall-through was to make it more admin-friendly and make it easier to predict when reading code how it was actually going to execute. But to compensate for that, we added the multiple comma-separated literals per when conditional, a when block. Also want to call out that repeating a literal in multiple when blocks is not allowed. So because that first block covers 2, 3, 4, we couldn't have another block that later covers 7 and 2. And finally, when else is the other notable syntactic difference. And with that, I don't know how much else there is to say about Switch until you get your hands on it and start giving us some real-world feedback. So we're going to talk about a couple of the things that Apex has been up to in the meantime. So in the spring release, we delivered list contains and index of, useful time-saving methods, the type of convenience feature that we think Apex developers need more of. That was 2,000 points, something that we snuck in just at the wire. We're proud that we got that in. In summer, we're delivering Switch, 17,000 points on the Idea Exchange. We're also doing 2 other major quality of life improvements that, as a longtime Apex developer, I pushed for pretty hard. The first one, the sockle count query is now going to count 1 row instead of 1 row that's aggregated. If you run a count query on a table with 100,000 rows, that is 1 row for limit purposes. It is no longer 100,000. Yes, that means you can run count queries without having to worry about limit exceptions. It's great. One caveat there is if you're using a group by clause, it will count as 1 query row per aggregate result returned. So by the number of groupings, but that's still effectively one per aggregation operation. So we're proud that we could convince the performance team to sign off on that. So hopefully you all enjoy it as much as I know I will. Another important one, quality of life thing, where we enhance the fidelity of the record type info class in Apex. Historically, this has exposed the name field of record type, but not the developer name field. And the name field on record type is the UI label. That means it's translated. That means it can have spaces. That means when an admin decides to relabel it, your code that's using record type info could break. A little bit suboptimal. So we teamed up with the record type team to get the developer name field added to this in Apex, so you no longer have to use a SOCL query to query for record types. You can use the describe features that saves you the limit usage. We also added a complementary method that gives you back a map of record types that is keyed by developer name, just like there's the map that is keyed by name. So that was 4,900 points on the idea exchange, and we're proud we found time to work that into summer. Going to talk about what's up next beyond that very briefly. This will be a little bit more abstract, but we're going to start off with performance. We do have a couple tangible things coming in summer. Anand actually worked on a couple of them, so he's going to mention them.
All right. So we at the Apex team think that Apex is a lot like this hot rod. It's really fancy. It can get you places. But there's a lot of room for optimization. So I'm going to ask a question to all of you in the audience. How many of you here feel that tests run really slowly during deployment? Can I get a show of hands? Awesome, everybody. So we may have something for you. As part of our True to the Core mission, we are trying to identify inefficiencies in the deployment process, specifically in how tests run during deployment. We know as a developer, you're eagerly waiting for your code to go in and all the tests to run, but the fact that it takes so long just makes it all the more tense. So we've been chipping away at certain inefficiencies, and in the spring release, we piloted a small change that improves the performance for customers that use declarative customizations and like process builders and flows a lot. And in that semi-pilot, we saw that some customers saw 25 to 30% improvement in their test runtimes. And we decided we got to harden that and make it generally available to you in the summer release. Now, this approach that we're taking to remove these inefficiencies is a framework, and we hope to build on it in the future as we identify more inefficiencies. The additional change we are making to tests is your vanilla test runs. If you're a developer and you want to get quick feedback as to whether a change you made broke some tests, you can now run that by skipping code coverage. We have included an option that allows you to skip code coverage calculation. We saw that that produces a 20% speed up in test time, and we hope that encourages more test-driven development. We also have another performance enhancement called compile and deploy, and I'll hand over to Chris, who'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so if you've worked with Apex in large organizations or organizations that have large numbers of concurrent users, you've probably discovered that after you make certain changes in the setup UI, after you make metadata API deployments, or after you perform packaging operations, the next request that runs Apex is a little bit slower. And why that is that when something makes changes to the shape of your org, its schema, its enabled features, et cetera, it invalidates the compiler output, the Apex bytecode, to make sure that it isn't running bytecode that's no longer valid for the shape of your organization. Previously, that bytecode cache would be flushed, and then it would be rebuilt on the next use, which meant your end users were the ones who had the performance hit of the compiler running on the first request and rebuilding the bytecode cache. We found that didn't scale up very well, especially for large organizations. And so we put a lot of effort into a feature, compile on deploy, that makes it so metadata operations, metadata API operations and things built on top of them, including packaging, including push upgrades, will now compile Apex and commit the bytecode as part of the metadata operation, which in some cases can cause extreme performance benefits, but even in minor cases is still a nice way to avoid complaints from your users right after you go add a new custom field in production. This is going to be turned on in all production orgs, always, and it will be optional through the setup menu and through the API for sandboxes, developer editions, scratch orgs, trials, et cetera. We'd recommend you turn this on for things like UAT environments or organizations you're doing continuous integration with where you want to profile test performance. For interactive development, we'd suggest you leave it off because it does add a little bit of overhead to your deployment times. Talking about what's next, secure development is something we've heard a lot about, especially from ISVs. Making sure you get CRUD checks, making sure you get FLS checks, making sure you get sharing checks just right adds a lot of code, and it adds some performance overhead. We've heard you. I come from an ISV background myself, and very much am in tune with that feedback. So we're looking at what we can do to make this easier on the platform right now. And this is something that we're still in the design phase, but something where feedback is definitely welcome. To give you an idea of what we're looking at for inspiration, because I don't have concrete plans to show you just yet, I'll cite something that Financial Force was kind enough to open source. Part of their fflib Apex Common library that's on GitHub, I put the link in the slides, is a class called Query Factory. And Query Factory does something fairly unique. It allows easy CRUD checks with a single method call. It allows FLS enforcement through that set enforce FLS true method you see. But it then, in the same query builder instance, Query Factory instance, allows you to disable FLS checks. So you can do something fairly novel, which is mix security contexts in the same query. But because you're being declarative about what security context you're in, this is something that the security team doesn't have a problem with. It's explicit what your intent is. And as long as you use this type of tool responsibly, it's something that can save you on limit usage, and it's something that can get you through security review easier. Now we know that there's a performance overhead of doing all this in Apex, which is one of the reasons we want to build something into the platform. But this is the type of use case we're thinking about. This is the type of direction we're headed in, and we're very interested in feedback in this area if you have particular pain points. With that, our call to action, get started with Salesforce DX, because Apex is part of the DX group in engineering and product. So we definitely want you to use DX, and a lot of the features we talked about for performance were in support of DX initiatives as well. It really is the future of development on the platform. So we strongly encourage you to get started with it if you don't have any experience yet. And we have quite a few suggested badges that you can go through if you're looking for next steps on getting more familiar with Apex, getting more familiar with Salesforce DX, et cetera. And with that, we're going to open up the floor to questions. Questions, please approach the mic, because we want to get those on the recording. Can you check the mic? Sorry.
Sorry about that. So I work in a fairly large org, and we have a lot of different groups that all kind of have the same deployment window. So we kind of have a set order. But we run into a lot of issues where someone deploys, and we can't really see how long the org's going to be locked up for. And also, I was curious if there was any idea to sort of queue. I've seen a couple times where you can queue up change sets, like one after another. I was curious if there was some kind of functionality that works to get some visibility on that.
So there's a separate product team for the metadata API and change sets, and I have some rough ideas of what their roadmap are, but I can't answer that authoritatively. I'm sorry.
No, that's all right. Thank you.
I know change sets are definitely something that we've received a lot of feedback on and are top of mind.
I just wanted to ask a question on the switch construct. Is that a statement that will just execute the instructions without returning anything, or can it be an expression that will return a value at the end?
I don't believe it. Can you repeat the
So
question?
is it just a statement that will execute all the instructions without returning a value? Or can it be like the sort of case, like the match statement in Scala, which will return like a value as an expression?
It doesn't return a value.
So it doesn't return
statements.
anything. Okay. Okay. So more like Java rather than Scala.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Yep.
So two questions. One on the switch and the Socal row limit. When do we get it?
You repeat the question to the mic just for recording?
Sure. For the switch statement and for the Socal count, when do we get it? When is it GA? And second, on the switch statement, can the literals be constants, final variables?
Yeah, people have asked that for the constants. They can't be them yet, but we've been thinking about it for future versions.
And your other questions? Summer. So they are checked in. They are done before our feature freeze deadline. So it's a forward-looking statement, and there's always a non-zero chance that I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure they're going out in summer.
Question regarding the future. Adding to the automatic typing of the S object, will you expand the sharing reasons for Apex sharing, which is right now only available on customer objects, for the the standard objects, because from time to time it's the only way to do things.
So that's actually not a question for Apex, and I'm revealing our org structure a little bit more than probably what you're looking for. But the standard entities, especially that are part of CRM and SFA, have their own teams and have some special implementation details because they're an older generation of how they were defined and have some scalability customization. So it's really up to the owner of the standard entity if they're going to do that. All the custom objects share the same framework that grants them a lot of features for free, but for standard entities, because they were built with closer to the metal type tuning, they don't automatically get features, and so it's up to the owner of the entity if they want to put the effort in on that. I would personally like to see Apex sharing become more powerful, and that's something I plan to talk to the sharing team about in the future. All right, if there's nothing else, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.